Excellent. Yes. We may still let some.
Okay. Welcome everybody for this morning session. Okay. So I'm really excited for the live panel. We should going to talk about a lot of different things, but then I wanted to welcome everybody for jumping on the call this morning. So early on a Friday. Gabriel. Yep. Next slide. Okay. So the first session is about rethinking the pipeline between academia and practice, where we are kind of going to cover subject as much as mentorship and the future of academia and practice, like how does the two relate to each other. And before we start, I want to kind of talk a little bit about what future vision is. So future vision is a two-day future symposium that bring industry professionals together to discuss topics about equity, diversity, and inclusion, their importance relative to the health of the industry, and develop tools necessary to promote equity in the profession. So that's what future vision is. And for this year, we chose a theme, and the overall theme for this year was elevate. The first question is how do we elevate diversity, equity, and inclusion to no hate? And the second one is what will it take us to get there? And then we are hoping that through the conversation that we are having, we are going to be able to, think about how to elevate design in many different ways and perspectives. And the first thing I want to do is also, thank our sponsor who are, kind of giving us an opportunity to do this. Hoffman, Opsis, PIA, and also we have a reception later this afternoon for those folks in Portland. And the LR Group is our sponsor for that event, and they are going to allow us to, celebrate it. But it's just for people who are, in person and able to attend in Portland. And then the next thing I want to do is like, this is all in Oregon, and I want to do a land acknowledgement. We would like to acknowledge the many tribes and bands who call Oregon their ancestral territory, including Bourne the Paiute, Confederated Tribes of Coos, Lower Umka, and Siuslaw, Confederated Tribes of Cow Creek, Lower Band of Umka, Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, Confederated Tribes of Siles Indian, Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, Confederated Tribes of Umatilla, Indian Reservation, Coquille Tribe, and Kamak Tribe, and honor the ongoing relationship between the land, plants, animals, and people indigenous to this place. We now call Oregon. We recognize the continued sovereignty of the 9 federally recognized tribes who have ties to this place and thank them for continuing to teach us how we might all be here together. Yeah. And then the next thing I want to do is I want to read our community agreement. And then one thing I didn't say is that I forgot to introduce myself. Anyway, I'm Mohammed. I'm a deaf designer. I didn't do that. I was supposed to do it. But then I'm the chair of the Committee on Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And then the thing we do is for every single of our meeting, we did our community agreement, which is engage to understand, give space and grasp, to decide, lesson assured, acknowledge the background and experience, respectfully challenge, it is not personal, lean into discomfort, examine the past, look to the future, present with intent and attention to impact, expect and accept the non-closure. That said, I am going to give the mic to Heather. Heather, do you want to say a word?
Yes, thank you, Mohammed. First, I'd like to thank everybody for being here this morning and joining us, all of our panelists, all of our sponsors, as you mentioned. We have some things coming up. First of all, the in-person reception tonight at DLR Group for this event, which we hope everyone who's available in Portland will attend. I'll put the link for that information in the chat as the meeting progresses. Also, the best way to view this presentation, I think, today for everyone is probably to put it in your view in side-by-side speaker and gallery, just because that'll probably give you the best presentation format for this discussion as we move forward today. I'd also like to say that if you have questions or if you want to have conversation, this will be relatively loose and acknowledged by the moderators in the panel for questions. But if while conversation is happening, you want to put something in the chat, I'll be keeping up with that and make sure that we get to those questions at the end of the conversation. If you have any technical issues, you can also chat me in the background and I'll try and help you in the background. We are obviously recording this presentation and hopefully if you want to share it afterwards, you'll check our website. We have a golf tournament coming up when you check the website, as well as our end of year design awards. So lots of things going on. We hope you'll take a look at before the end of the year. And thank you for being here again today.
Thanks, Heather.
So I was going to say, Tolai, our moderator is Kelly, and Kelly, I am going to give you the mic and I will be in the background. So it's all yours now. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. And as mentioned earlier, we are here for day 2 of the Future Vision Symposium. And our session today is titled, Can we rethink the pipeline between academia and the practice of architecture? Excited to have a conversation around what that means and what we can take away as action items to address that topic. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Anna to start the introduction of our panelists.
Good morning, everyone. Does everyone have their coffee? My name is Anna Yoakum. I'm the co-founder of NOMA PDX. I graduated with my bachelor's in architecture in 2020. So I had the, classic YouTube role, walk across the stage, I guess. After we graduated, we decided there was a need for a professional chapter of NOMA in Oregon. So me and my 2 friends from school, we created the first chapter, and then now we're hosting the national conference this October. Since then, I've just been trying to gain more experience in the industry, using my role as a bridge between cultures and creative professions to make more collaborations with other BIPOC artists and creatives locally in our town. So I'm really excited to be here, and we'll see how this conversation goes.
Hello all, my name is Bianca Claret. I graduated from Kennesaw State in Atlanta, Georgia in 2022 with my bachelor's of architecture and my bachelor's of science and construction management. I relocated to Oregon to work with a local general contractor, Lease Crutcher Lewis, as a project engineer in the summer of 2022, and I've been here for exactly a year. I strive in my career to learn construction methods, learn construction personnel, really understand how we can bridge the gap between construction and architecture and become more of a team in a community as opposed to partners that typically have strife between each other. I definitely want to figure out ways that we can try to integrate that more into the practice of architecture and the practice of construction management so that we see each other as equals as opposed to potential, how do we say, threats to each other in a way, making it more of a seamless process in the built industry.
Good morning, everybody. Julian Owens, architect at Jacobs out of DC, currently in Melbourne, Australia until December. Co-founder of Clemson's NOMAS chapter and also the national parliamentarian of NOMA currently. Really excited to be here. Very familiar and very friendly with quite a few of the panelists. And just excited to have a good conversation today.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Niaz Addison. My mother immigrated from Iran in her mid-20s, and my dad was a Pacific Northwest grown hippie. I like to say that because it just adds a little bit of context to who I am. I also grew up on an island in the South Pacific called American Samoa. I just recently graduated from PSU with my Master's of Architecture. Hooray. And I'm currently still unemployed, which might be a story that is familiar to people nowadays. I used to work as a regional coordinator for a program for middle schoolers and youth that was like based in mentorship and empowerment. And while I was in university doing my master's, I was able to serve as a teaching assistant. So I got to meet a lot of the undergrad students, and it really kind of rounded out my university experience and taught me a lot about how mentorship or partnership or friendship can manifest in nuanced ways across the professional board, from like a student thinking about what they want to do with their lives as a child to continuing and pursuing education to entering the workforce. And I'm excited to be here. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Rashad Dorsey. I'm from South Carolina, rural town in South Carolina. I recently graduated from Harvard University Graduate School of Design with a master's in architecture. While at Harvard, I sort of founded our GSD NOMA chapter and served on our Dean's Diversity Cabinet Board. This past summer, I was a lead instructor for our Harvard Design Discovery program, and also received a Bachelor of Architecture from Clemson University, where with Julian co-founded our NOMAS chapter there as well. And currently I'll be teaching at Clemson University this year, and I work with previous offices of Atelier Corey Henry in Los Angeles, WW Architecture in Boston, Pattern House in St. Louis, and most recently Howard Yoon in Boston. And then this past summer as well, I collaborated with Tony Griffin of Urban AC for her Venice Biennale exhibition, and also as the co-founder or co-editor of Oblique Volume 4, a journal on anti-racist discourse practices. And my research interest lies at the intersection of architecture, critical conservation, culture, and spatial planning, and exploring how these intersections can begin to interrogate and inform the built environment. And super excited about this conversation today. And thank you for having me.
Hello, my name is Ray Huff. I'm a fellow of the American Institute of Architects, also a NOMA person. But I'm happy to be here today. Thanks for having me. It's like, it feels like I'm amongst family, and we're about to have a nice dinner, and we're going to chat about a lot of good things. So I'm excited to be here. I'm a native Charlestonian, practice in Charleston for some 45 years. In the late 90s, I formed a practice, Huff Gooden Architects with Mario Gooden. And we opened an office in New York and had one in Charleston, and had a great run, a lot of fun, but I have since retired from practice. I also, under the tutelage of John Jacks, who's in our audience today, founded the Clemson Architecture Center in Charleston, which has grown into a rather robust program as a part of the Clemson's now College of Architecture, Arts, and Construction, what we call a fluid campus. And we have centers in Genoa, Italy, Barcelona, Charleston, which is the larger of the three off-campus centers, for opportunities for our students to be able to work in other locales, other cultures. We set it up in Charleston in particularly because it's one of America's finest urban environments, and what a wonderful backdrop in which to introduce young people to architecture. So delighted to be a part of this. I always feel like there seems to be this curious conduit between, this railroad between Clemson and Portland. I don't know how many people we have in Portland who have Clemson connections, but it appears to be quite a number. Thanks for having me here.
Hi. So I'm glad to be here, and so many of our ex-students, and yes, the Clemson connection seems to be very strong. I'm a professor at Portland State University and the co-founder of the Center for Public Interest Design here. I am a native of Latin America, and I came as a political exile here, and then proceeded to go into architecture after having worked in Barcelona and being inspired by the revolution that happened in Barcelona, where architects took command of the reconstruction of the city after fascism, and decided architecture was the way to make change and to reconnect with my continent that I left behind. And I entered the UN coming out of architecture, and a group of us, after working in emergency relief reconstruction, realized that the problem was with the academy and how architects were being trained to engage problems and social issues. So in the 80s, we went back into the profession, into teaching, and created a network which has supported us in the last 4 decades of trying to come up with innovation, field work, all sorts of work to engage what now is being called public interdesign, and to kind of create the field, because basically we didn't know what practices, protocols, how to take on public interdesign, how to make design a tool for change. So that's what I've been trying to do. And I spent the first 2 decades at Washington and University of Texas, and now at Portland State. And I don't know, our legacy is our students. Had 2,000 have gone through that programs. So.
Good morning, everyone. Just love to hear the recaps from all of my friends and colleagues, Sergio and Ray. Our histories have intersected over time. I'm an architect, urban designer, broad career that bounced back and forth between private practice and public service, including having been a partner in my own firm for 20 years at Raw in LA, but then working for the federal government, GSA, in the Office of the Chief Architect, back and forth, most recently been with ZGF for now almost 5 years, but before that worked for Mayor Duggan in Detroit for 3 years as the urban design director for the central part of the city. Longtime NOMA family member, former national president for NOMA, Whitney Young Award winner from the AIA in 2016. The awards are just an affirmation that the values that are of importance to myself and shared by many of you on this call are the basis of relevance for how we operate in this space that we're in. And just to give Sergio props, it shouldn't be such an uphill battle to blow up the profession and rebuild it in a way that is productive and useful for our fellow citizens. And yet there's always a tension between the academy. I see Rashad's with that GSD pedigree now, we're gonna have to, modify your vocabulary, brother, and get you into Sergio's camp. But I think it's all good. It takes a village, and we've got a great one to talk to the audience today. So thanks for having me here.
Thank you all. And just to quickly introduce myself as the moderator of the panel, I'm Kelly Chinopis. I am an architect also in Portland with ZGF Architects, and I am a past COEDI chair. So this symposium is very special to me. So thank you to Mohammed for the invitation to participate, and to our great panelists for our upcoming discussion. So to kick off our conversation in the relationship between the pipeline and academia and the practice of architecture, one of the, I think the historical methods we think of that link is mentorship. So I wanted to ask the panelists as the first question, what is mentorship, and why do we mentor, and why do those of us coming out of academia into architecture seek out mentors?
Anyone in particular you're looking for to kick?
Yeah.
I think it's
on you, Steve.
Yeah, Stephen, maybe if you could kick us off, and then Anna has her hand up. So let's go to Anna next.
Sure, great. Well, I see mentoring in a number of different forms. In our offices, when we have entry level candidates that come in, they're immediately looking for guidance that's more technical in nature. So they're a mentorship to help bring your skills up. But I think a lot of us are interested in the other kind of mentoring, which sort of crosses the line into life coaching, where you're really looking to understand and be empathetic to the individuals who have come to you, to understand what their conditions and situations are, and to lend your experience selflessly to help them create a pathway for themselves that is empowering and helps them self-realize. So a lot of the mentoring that I do is in that lane. If you want to learn how to do sections and using Revit, don't come to me.
Well, I'll pick up from what Stephen has just said. I've been thinking about this question. It's an interesting one, and I kind of wrote down some terms that I thought may have application as to how I think about it. The idea of stewarding, shepherding, guiding, empowering, nurturing, grandparenting. Like your grandparents, your grandma and your grandpa, those are the ones that you remember, those nuggets of wisdom that they would impart over a dinner or on a walk. And I think that's part of it, what Stephen was getting at as well, this notion that it's not just about how to detail or how to navigate the office, which is a critical part, but it's also about how you navigate life. And I think that's a critical role that we who are more advanced in the profession have. I've always tried to encourage students to find that your own ethos. What is it that drives what you do, that shapes your approach to life, approach to people, approach to your work? And how is that grounded in some basis of who you are as a person, how you wish to impact the future? So in many ways, it's part of the traditional notion of mentoring. And I think sometimes we think of mentoring as almost apprenticeship, which is what the process used to be called many years ago, Steve and many others would remember. But I really think it's more than that. And I think it's particularly true for young people who are not white, others who maybe don't have the models there. And so it's important to the Steves, the Johns, the Sergios, the Julians, the Rashads to step into that void and say, let me show you how I did it and help you find the way you should be doing that.
Anna, maybe you could share your perspective.
Yeah, when we met up in preparation for this, I really like when we broke down the terms mentoring versus sponsorship. Like when we made the NOMA chapter here, I didn't have any like older mentors. And so my mentors were someone who were next to me, which was like my fellow colleagues in studio. And so I think the role of mentors who are people who are like your age or 2 to 3 years ahead, so they know they can give you advice that like applies from where they were just at. And then sponsorship was more so roles that I got to connect with once we made the chapter with people who are like 10, 20 years ahead of me. And they're like sponsorships that actually get to like make a decision on where your career could land, where mentors can maybe like advise you on how to go into that interview or how to prepare yourself in the day-to-day. But sponsorships could sponsors can actually like change the outcome kind of. So I thought that was an interesting difference.
And I guess for me, like defining mentorship really is about sort of building my community. I think since I was little, like I grew up in a rural area, so finding a mentor has always been hard to do, coming from where I came from in terms of having similar visions that I wanted to set out for in life. But and so like I'll probably mention later, but like I was always inspired by like celebrities in a way. Like I recently last week went to the Basketball Hall of Fame to see Dwayne Wade give his acceptance speech, and I'm like, how I consider him a mentor, even though I never met him. But I think for me, just grasping to people who are doing great things, who are speaking out against things, who are standing up for themselves and standing up for their community, always inspired me. But like as I grew and got into Clemson, and like having mentor, like Julian was my first mentor. Like I consider him my first mentor. Because he introduced me to architecture and introduced me to the world of architecture. And then having Ray as a professor, like I just continued to build this community that I'm so very thankful for, and just helping me understand and navigate this world. And I think Ray and Stephen mentioned this earlier about this idea of mentorship beyond like the professional quotation of mentorship. It's really, I think, especially with all we went through these past few years, like the personal mentorship and understanding people's values and needs has become extremely important in terms of navigating through architecture, for sure.
I always think it's so funny when Rashad calls me a mentor because we're the same age. But I think it's been interesting for me. I think my perspective of mentorship and what it means and its value has kind of changed from when I was the mentee to being the mentor. Because I think back to, going into Clemson School of Architecture, I didn't know anything about architecture at all. So I was really kind of surprised to learn the numbers of people of color within the field. So I think for me at that point, mentorship was really just reaching out to people to actually understand that my goals were achievable. They were tangible. And then those people actually ended up being more of a support group than I actually expected. And so now in the position of a mentor, I see myself like, yeah, absolutely. I'll talk about achieving things and things being achievable and whatnot. But like that support part is probably the more important part to me personally. But I also understand now that like mentorship is different for different people depending on what capacity you have. I don't go to the same people that I go to for career advice aren't the same people that I go to for personal life advice all the time. You know.
So I definitely would piggyback a lot off of what Julian and Rashad said, because I'm in a similar position where it's like, I was once a mentee, now I'm a mentor, now we're in like this weird in-between space. And support is currently, and I think a lot of for emerging professionals and early professionals, that's a lot of what we need right now. There's this interesting gap that's happening in our industry, and we're playing a major role in how to figure out how to close that gap and how to connect the students to the professional world and figuring out how we see our career in the future. And the industry is forever changing, whether that be from an environmental standpoint or from a buildability standpoint. There's so many changes happening right now that it can get kind of convoluted, and the support factor comes in very strong here, especially for this particular age of young and early professionals that's happening right now.
I love that. I was, the conversation went around, started out with this kind of thing about where the profession started it really started as a mentorship. I mean, you went to somebody's office and you learned the profession, and then the licensure happened, this kind of thing. And it's interesting. We kind of technify the profession, and it became this kind of great tool, but really we're kind of, in a way, we're going reaction to going back to how it started out, which was you were building a community of people that supported you, and young and old, and all the people who had experience in the field and others. And I think one of the struggles within teaching, and with us preparing, we have this degree in public and design, is trying to nurture students kind of their own kind of groups, their own community of mentors, you know, and who will support them as they transition out of school and into the profession. And so I think that's it kind of, the whole mentorship thing has come back almost as a kind of a counter argument to how technical, as Stephen was saying at the beginning, the profession is. You go in, you have to learn just technical things, and you can be, and yet mentorship has almost like a radical act of expanding and reminding us that it really is about serving communities. And so we start out with our own community we create of mentors, and it reminds us what the focus is. So it's great.
That's great. Maybe adding on to that or continuing parts of that conversation, something we talked about in the prep sessions too, was just sometimes the past kind of mentorship models have left students maybe feeling isolated or not knowing how to navigate making those connections, moving out of academia into practice. What are some either experiences or ideas that everyone has that could prevent that from happening and continue kind of this more robust path that mentorship can take? Stephen, do you want to kick us off with that?
Sure. I first want to compliment the PDX NOMA chapter for students who had an experience in college with NOMA as NOMAS, perhaps, carrying that forward into the profession, because NOMA has historically had a large percentage of the membership as student chapter members. And yet when those students graduated and entered the profession, they very rarely, unless they were Black, extended that NOMA family into the professional ranks. And so there was a real imbalance that has really started to ebb and really turn in much more positive direction. And I really, again, want to compliment the PDX chapter for taking that leap. And I think you will be rewarded as you are joined into this larger fraternity, sorority, family of us who really are an incredible support network, right? So I know that's not exactly responding to the prompt, but I think it was important to say that and to give that encouragement.
Ray, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I just, one of the things that has always been interesting about architecture is you think about architecture historically, it's been a bit of an elite kind of profession, right? In which, the influence that architects have globally is always been less than we think it does. So there's a kind of a small sort of cache of people who are exposed to architecture. So I have always found it extremely difficult. And I've done a lot of this in trying to encourage young people of color to enter the profession. It's always been difficult because they don't see the models. They don't see, that's not part of their experience or our experience as young people. So the exposure that that would be important and incumbent to sort of introducing a larger group of folks to see the delight and extraordinary reward of being an architect has been really a struggle. And I think that's, the mentoring kind of begins really early for me. It's like we work with local schools and community groups to sort of let them see, particularly in our community engagement projects at the Clemson Center, let them see young people involved in the design of and reshaping of their own communities. And so there's this kind of clear and direct relationship. I tell this story all the time, and it's a bit of a lie, but it's a good story. I go to high schools and what have you in junior high. One of the first questions that always gets asked is, well, how much does an architect make? And I used to tell the truth. And I realized that's not working. Now I used to say, it's $100,000 to start. Get you going. Because the reality is there's just simply lack of awareness. And I think building that within our communities through our work as well as our mentorship, not just of architectural graduates and architecture students, but mentorship of our communities to help people realize the important role that architecture should have. And I know, Sergio, that's what your work is all about, and I applaud that.
Let's go to Niaz next and then Anna.
Okay, thank you, Kelly. I think when I think about the question that you brought up and what people have been talking about recently, I think about, I don't know the correct word to describe it, but like advocacy maybe, and how I grew up, really it feels like in a foreign land. I grew up like not here, and had two crazy parents that also were like bizarre and not kind of part of the social norms. So things that are like normal aren't familiar to me. And then additionally, I didn't have mentorship growing up until like right when I left the island. Then I started to have mentorship, which was a shame. But so like being completely unfamiliar to the way that this this particular location on the planet is, as well as unfamiliar to mentorship, it was really hard for me to understand how to interact with people, much less make friends or get mentorship when I needed it. So now when I am interacting with all the young folks that I've interacted with, I make an extra effort to make it so that they have access to me and to other people that might be useful or helpful to them, either in their professional life or their personal life, whatever the case may be, like kind of acting as a connection point. But like it's like a lot of extra effort to like be accessible. So that might look like bringing donuts to like a space, or like offering food or comfort as like an element of community building. Or it might be like asking someone there's like a gray area and like a line between too personal and like vague, like how's the weather, but trying to ask people questions that are a little bit more meaningful than like how's your day going, like how's your family, or how have you, like what are you passionate about and how have you been able to explore that recently, or how are you experiencing joy or love, so that people know that, at least for myself and the people that I'm like sending them off to, that there's like a sincere care into their lives and well-being that stretches beyond what might be stereotypical, and that care is always accessible and like overwhelmingly so, just to assure that if there's anyone, especially part of what we talked about in the prep sessions was like folks that are particularly marginalized or particularly left out of the conversations, that those folks deserve and should have the opportunity to get really quality and choice mentorship. But at the same time, that some of those folks might feel extremely unworthy or have been told that they were dumb or not allowed, or that this wasn't for them, or that it could never be possible, that it's extremely hard to like reach out to someone who you perceive as maybe having more experience than you, or knowing things in the slightest, that those folks should create opportunity for that access to be so present, and that no barriers, like the limiting of barriers as much as possible. Even in I know I didn't speak first today, but sometimes when there's like awkward silences, I just say whatever's on my mind, because I'm willing to take the arrow or the bullet and like be the awkward person, so that other people know like, oh, like that person said something ridiculous. I can now say what I'm saying because it's not going to be as ridiculous as whatever that person just said. Yeah, thanks.
Anna, do you want to go next?
Yeah, your question, you said how we can prevent against people feeling isolated in the profession. And I guess we had to like look into more like modern ways of doing that. Like especially in 2020 when I was graduating, I was like, okay, now I need to really like build my network. But of course it was the pandemic. So factoring in that now, like people, we also feel isolated behind our screens, but it's also been a really good way to like build community. I think that's one way, like embracing technology is basically one way we can maybe prevent it. And then another way is feeling isolated. So mentorship is like anything that teaches you something. And so when I didn't have mentors or sponsors like in school, what I was using to teach me and like guide me through the process was like what I learned on YouTube or what I learned like from podcasts. Like that, those were my mentors because I didn't have a physical person to associate it to. So fostering like in-person and online spaces, and then also like Niaz was mentioning, like providing the space to have grace, because like entering like a capitalist profession, like there's a certain values that are prioritized, like confidence and like advocating for yourself, which in some cultures or in other people's experiences, like that could be seen as rude or like weird or unfamiliar. And so providing those spaces to connect are going to be invaluable moving forward.
Rashad, do you want to share?
Yeah. So yeah, for me, I think sort of being able to bridge between academia and practice. I kind of go back to Nia's point of just asking questions, like simply, and I think thinking about how can we begin to like break hierarchies in mentorship, like and in a profession. I think generally just like asking the uncomfortable questions to your mentors and saying vice versa if your mentor is asking you the uncomfortable questions to you. And I think for me, like all of 9 times out of 10 opportunities that bridged between academia and practice for me often came by just asking every professor I had, like, where's opportunity? How can you mentor me? Can you help me through this situation? Even though I probably only spoke with them once in my life, but I'm not afraid to ask for help, and really just, yeah, extending your hand out and seeing who's there to help. Thanks. Yeah.
Julian, let's hear from you next.
Ray made a point earlier and I completely forgot it because there have been plenty of good points made. But whatever he said, it made me think that I think the problem of isolation, especially like within architecture schools at times, I think it'll start to go away once, the standard or typical pedagogy taught within schools isn't so insular. And I think, for instance, community-based programs like the one at Portland State, we have the community design build program back at Clemson, and then the newer equitable design class. Like when there are more things being taught that are focused on the community and not just like, here's your site, design this library. I think to, the project pipeline camps that NOMA has every summer, and I'm thinking about the kids that are in these camps, and some of them, if you go to that camp and you're getting really excited about architecture because you're with your friends, you're with other people in your community, and you're engaging in design, and then you decide to pursue architecture, you go to a school that maybe doesn't have a community-based course or doesn't have anything teaching about how to effectively engage with the community and teaching you the power that architects have. And then add on top of that the fact that you probably don't identify with the dominant demographic within architecture, you're immediately isolated. And so I think the focus on yes, design, but also community engagement will definitely put an end, effective community engagement will definitely start to put an end to people feeling so isolated when they come into the field. And I think it's starting to happen because we're seeing a lot of programs pop up across the nation.
Awesome. Thanks, Julian. Let's hear from Bianca next.
Yeah, really to piggyback off of what Julian's saying a lot is allowing, especially in the school environment, the idea of learning community process, community engagement, understanding who these communities are and how we can interact with them through architecture, I think is a very massive learning curve that the industry is going through right now. I know for my thesis, when I was doing 5th year in my architecture program, my thesis was community focused. And for a large portion of it, a lot of people didn't understand what the accomplishment was supposed to be and how we were supposed to rally around that accomplishment. If X community doesn't accept Y community, how can we make them marry each other and bring those communities together? That was a very big part of it. My thesis was ultimately unsuccessful, but I think if we start teaching our students to engage more in that aspect of the architectural environment and the built environment, not only will they learn understanding for other people and the way that their lives are being experienced, but they'll be more passionate for what the field is starting to become.
Thanks, Bianca. Let's go to Sergio.
Yeah, I like the conversation because it's kind of reminding me that, I mean, it is, we've been talking about networking, but really a lot of our education and really the way I've done this education for the last 4 decades is really based in field work, taking students out as much as possible. Even at the Center of Public and Design, we take in projects all the time. NIAS, all these students were involved in with some community. And I think what public interest design and this work is reminding people, and we are reminding by coming from the margins and coming in, is that you know, it's reminding the profession that it is really about people and the impact that these buildings have on people that the profession has somehow lost track of. And so, you know, I'm often quoted as saying, I made some quotes some years ago as we were evaluating the impact of the work we were doing. And I said, you know, like 90% of the impact of our buildings is not the building itself, but the capacity and relationships it has built in the community. So as you get, if you're in school and you begin to participate in a project where you realize that what's happening is the relationships they're building, the sense of being able to do change, all that, if you're beginning to see that as one of the lessons you're learning in school, then the vision you come out with architecture and the importance of people in that role is, you know, in architecture, you know, becomes part of your approach, and it kind of changes the role of architecture within the community. And I think that that's maybe one of the big contributions we're doing by coming in is reminding architecture that it lost its way, you know, that it really is about people and communities. And so I think that everything people have been saying here is really kind of on target with what we've been trying to.
Stephen, we'll go to you and then we'll shift discussion topics.
Well, I'm just going to, as we say at ZGF, right, I'm going to pile on a little bit because I was interested in where the conversation was headed. And I just wanted to share that when I was teaching at University of Michigan at the Taubman School, I created a seminar called Designing with Community. There was a real thirst on the part of students. And there was just one other brother who was teaching there who was basically doing a very similar class to what I did. But I had the good fortune for my role with the city of leading a number of neighborhood framework plans that had required community engagement meetings. And, you know, you talk about meaningful community engagement, that's really a key phrase. We would literally, because Detroit's experiencing a lot of new investment and a new population, in quotes, you have legacy residents who've been calling the city for 15 years about a broken sidewalk, and then a new family moves in on the corner, and all of a sudden the next week, the sidewalk's getting fixed. So there's a lot of fear and trepidation reverberating through the community. So I would have the students actually come to the community meetings. They'd come from Ann Arbor into Detroit, and I'd give them roles to perform, just like I guess Sergio was talking about Niaz and her cohort. That is life-changing, not only for the students, and I wanted to make this clarification about mentoring. It is most certainly a two-way street. If you're genuine, authentic, and you're giving of yourself and your soul and spirit, you're going to get that channel is open, and you're going to get it both ways. And so we have to remain humble and remain open to growing and learning through experiences that may be new to a newer generation that weren't around when we were coming through. And so we have to be able to understand that. So I think those are the most healthy relationships. I'm just really proud that two of my former students from Michigan actually work in the firm at ZGF right now. One of them's in the LA office where I am. The other one's in New York. And so, I keep reminding them that they're now soldiers. They got to go out and carry the torch, which is a big part also of what we might require of our mentees to step in and step up.
I think this conversation has brought a lot of interesting points up. Also, I think forcing us maybe to look at what in academia can also evolve and adjust to meet both the needs of, I think, the way that we're looking towards design being that more of that community engagement. Let's remember that we design for people. I'm wondering if there are thoughts on, we talked in this past question a little bit about what is going on in academia that is allowing for some of this evolution and transition, as Stephen was mentioning, like bringing community engagement back into, some of the coursework. Are there other ways academia could continue to evolve and adjust to better address some of the topics we're talking about? I'd be interested from our emerging professionals on the panel to know either what you felt was missing, what you would want more of, or if you had an experience that fulfilled what you were looking for in terms of how you want design to be. And then maybe from our more experienced panelists, what have you seen throughout the course of your careers that might lend to this evolution? And we'll start with Anna on this.
All right, in terms of like changes or what I wish I would have seen while I was in school, I remember being friends with like other people in different majors, and a lot of the times in their seminars they would be talking about the role of the architects. It's like community development, urban planning kind of majors, and I always wondered like why we don't occupy the same room, even though like once you leave school you'd probably be in like shared rooms. So the interesting thing about architecture was like I felt like to be good at it you had to like live in studio, and I wish that we had gotten out more, like the community stuff through the studios were nice, but like I wish we would have collaborated with other majors and like more on a one-on-one, and because that's what the real world's going to be like. Also, Bianca,
Bianca, let's hear from you.
Yeah, I 110% agree. As someone who did eventually go into doing double majors, I definitely think architects put themselves on an island. And maybe this is something that we're transforming. I know at least while I was in school, it felt like architecture students felt like they were more superior than everybody else that they partner with in the profession. And I honestly felt like that was a fault in the educational process. I definitely wish while I was in school that, and something that I continue to do as a alumni of my school, is teach students you can do more with your degree than just design a building or do some ADA drawings. As much as that's needed in the practice, just open your eyes, take some time, think about, like, if you have an interest in a particular standpoint, read about that interest, see how you can be impactful, do personal projects, definitely take the time to continue to learn outside of what you're taught in the studio environment. That's something that I continue to just talk to other students about. I make sure that they know they have options. They don't have to go into an architecture firm. They don't have to eventually be a licensed architect if they don't want to. It's not a checked box system. You have options, and make sure that you explore them while you're in school, because that's the best time to explore them.
Yeah, and
Ray, go ahead.
Yeah, for me, I think I'm gonna go back to the community point and kind of gonna tout Ray Huff and the Charleston program, because for me that was my first experience really learning how to speak and speak to people like that are outside of the profession. Like I remember our meetings and we met in someone's living room, we met in the church, we met like outside of an abandoned school, and like just really understanding how to like talk to people and like speak common language and understand like where people needs and wants are. I think that's something I felt like, yeah, even at the GSD, I didn't get any of that at the GSD. I got that at Clemson, but and so I think that I'm having to somehow relearn how to speak again and speak to and understand how to talk to people in ways that they could see how architecture can inspire and create spaces that excite them. And so yeah, that's kind of how I approach that question.
Ray, let's hear from you.
Yeah, architecture education has a long history, and it hasn't changed dramatically. I think we're starting to see change accelerate within the academy. But for so long it was a really hermetic thing. You went into the studio, you practically lived there, you worked on a project, and the only people you ever engaged with were your colleagues in the studio and the critics. And the model now is to expose students to broader public service work. And to pick up on what Rashad was just saying, we just had a recent experience through our design build program where we built a pavilion over a drainage pond in a primarily African-American neighborhood. And our juries for those projects were on site. And we would invite anybody who wanted to come in to sort of look at the project. There weren't drawings, the building is there. And there was an older Black gentleman that came in that I had not seen before. And he came in a wheelchair and came up to the platform and listened. And at some point when the students were fundamentally completed with their work, he said, "Can I say something?" And of course we acknowledged him. And he said, "I've been in this community for many, many years." And he said, I tutor young people, young Black kids. And he says, "I'm tutoring the third generation of some families. And the tutoring that we do are the basics, reading, writing, arithmetic, but they also tutor students, these young people, in how to have a bank account. These are his words, how to eat in a restaurant, how to engage someone that you're not familiar with. These are just sort of basic life lessons that they were imparting." And as he finished his commentary, he started tearing up. And he said to the students, he says, "You have no idea what a remarkable thing you've done here by building this pavilion." He said, "Because now I can teach young people how to fish," which almost brings me to tears when I think about it. At that moment, and maybe it's not taught in the mentorship, but I will assure you that moment, that group of 12 students took a message was so powerful and so indelible that will influence the rest of their life. Because again, they saw it in its pure rawness of this elderly man who can barely move around, relating his efforts quietly within that community, and then applauding their architecture for what it did. So I think I tell that story oftentimes to students now because I want them to understand why it's so important what we do. Design Build offers that because there tend to be well, they're present, they're things, right? But oftentimes in projects that are not fully realized in that regard. The other thing I want to talk about a little later is the notion of, we're talking about sort of community-centric the design in that regard, but there's also, I will still argue, there's still a critical role for architecture that we've sort of looked at and it's been tarnished. But I do think architecture, which is, as we know, a fundamentally political act. And so how we think about that becomes important. But thank you.
Yeah, let's go ahead.
Thank you. I have a lot of thoughts about this question, particularly because I've been hearing the like midnight cries of undergrad students for like the past 4 years, virtually and physically. And so it's a little bit hard for me to organize my thoughts, but I'm gonna try. And I think it is related to what Ray was just saying. And early on in my education, in all the architecture classes, Sergio was like one of my first professors. I had this experience where a lot of the things that I understood to be true in life were being attacked is a strong word, but like we're being like ripped apart and remelded together, particularly because at PSU, I think there's like a heavy emphasis on phenomenology in the beginning. It feels like a dirty word to say, but phenomenology, especially in the early classes. And there's an emphasis on like theory and like what is architecture and all that stuff that we're all familiar with BSing about. Oh, sorry if that's not appropriate. But I remember, and as simultaneous to that experience, I was also coordinating this beautiful mentorship program for middle schoolers and high schoolers. So I was thinking a lot about like their development. And I realized like at the end of my degree, like 2 months ago, after like some upwards of 6 years in school, that like I wasn't being helped to be a good person in university. And maybe that's not the goal of university, and maybe that's not the goal of my teachers or whatever. But I think the way that I perceive education, and I mean education in like a really broad sense, like not necessarily in the school as we know it right now, but the role of education in our society is like the umpteenth, like it's like so important. And educators in a broad sense too are so important and invaluable to society, especially for young people. And that in that educating is also like being just learning how to be a good human and a good person. And in architecture, it's important in so many fields, but in architecture, it's also important in a greater degree because we're making decisions that are extremely political and extremely influential on people's lives. Not necessarily the end all be all, like architecture doesn't solve everything, but it influences a lot of things dramatically. And so and it baffles me when I think about this, that it isn't like a prime thing in our school, but like if the people that are making those huge decisions don't know how to be good people, then like what kinds of decisions are they making? Especially I've had people, and I can see in the chat there's like this conversation about like the act of not allowing people to talk with other people that should be talked to inform those designs. I've been in reviews where reviewers have told me straight up without a blink, they're not going to understand what we're talking about. Why would we talk about, why would we invite them to the conversation? Like they're going to feel disempowered and they're going to feel dumb. And it kills me. It releases a fire in my heart that like the fires of hell, because if someone who is professional and is like in that role of making decisions, doesn't know how to be a good person, didn't make friends with their studio mates because they were put in this like corrosive environment where they were supposed to like fight against each other for positions in class, grades, actually entering the program, all these different things, right? If that person can't communicate to another human being what the decisions are that they're making or trying to make, then like it's not architecture. It's failed. Like it can't be architecture without the people part. And I think that contributes to the isolation, that contributes to the way that people interact outside of school. Like I've had friends who like feel awkward about talking about how much they make or like what projects they're doing because of that like training that happens during university. That's like completely bizarre. And someone else acknowledged that it's like because the profession is fueled by capital in the way that we understand it now. Maybe I'll stop talking, but just the like the people part, like we can also like help students learn together about being good people at the same time as learning how to draw those ADA paths to their buildings. Yeah.
Go ahead, Rashad.
Yeah, I just had one more additional thing that I think this is bringing out a lot of me too. And it's just like, I think for me, also just being able to bring your own personal background to school and like have that be accepted was something I struggled a lot with. And I mean, yeah, even at the GSD, like my thesis was really around like my background and my culture, but like no one was able to, in our faculty was able to talk to me really in that sense, other than like a few handful of people who were my advisors. But like on my mid review, my final review, it just was awkward because no one knows how to engage or like engage outside of their comfort zone. And so I think for me, that's something that yeah, I hope can change and people can evolve their minds to think outside of that canonized approach that architecture is held within.
Go to Sergio.
Sorry, trying to unmute myself. You know, one of the things I think is kind of wonderful about, you know, like having a program and all that, there are now many programs across the country that bring students into that kind of like the social interactions that create a project, is that there's conflict. It's not total agreement. And it's kind of, you know, we tend to kind of in architecture idealize who's going to support our project, and we don't have a relationship to the community. So we begin to create an inner fantasy about what our project's going to do and everything till you bring it to a community and you realize that it's, you know, there's going to be diversity about the ways it will impact the community. And that's a rich experience. And I think back, you know, when I started, I was thinking about when I got started, and I used to actually be a pure mathematician. And I went to Barcelona to do my thesis coming out of Berkeley. And I was out there in the meeting, and there was this guy, Oriol Bohigas, who became the great master planner of the Barcelona we see now. And he was having conversations outside the cathedral with the whole community about what did we want Barcelona to be in the future. And he was kind of laying out the framework which would create all of it, you know, the reconstruction of Barceloneta and all these things. And what I found empowering was just I was thinking, God, I left South America, you know, there's been military dictatorships. We've never had these kind of conversations about the future of our country. And it's being led by an architect. And I walked down and I said, I'm changing professions. I'm going to be an architect, because here's a profession that's engaged in talking about the future that I would like to talk about. So I think I went into it just thinking, architecture is the only thing that's going to make me a citizen or allow me to be a citizen. So all the discussions that I'm hearing from all the younger members here, I'm thinking, God, I felt this. That's what drove me into the profession, you know, and it's what fed me through the profession and the years of learning all this stuff and, you know, getting qualified and everything like that. And I think that it's the thing that I've tried to keep alive, because it's in my teaching. And I'm so glad to hear it, you know, that people are thinking about it, because And it's the complexity of, sometimes we forget that we have to have a full agreement. We don't. It's a being able to negotiate those differences and understand that any building can be created out of different points of view. And the building can be a point of coming together, of a moment where we all come together. Because the thing that, kind of overwhelms architecture is that in the 20th century, with the cost of construction and everything, it's become a capitalist enterprise because so much is invested to make them that we forget the reason why we're making them. And so that's, I think, the countercurrent that we're trying to create, the counterpoint that we're trying to create in education, I think, all the people who are represented here. So.
Stephen, do you want to add to that?
Well, I just wanted to backtrack on the prior comments, Rashad's comment. The more of us who are invited to be critics and jurors at reviews, the better the socialization of the culture as an individual with lived or understood lived experience can engage with the candidate in a conversation that the other jurors are learning from, that gives them the opportunity to open their eyes should they choose to do so and be more inquisitive, more curious, and then maybe take that with them as they go forward to the next jury, where they can be mindful and be less dismissive or less agnostic about engaging with that project because they lack a fundamental understanding of the cultural expression or signature that's happening there. And I do want to say that in this post-George Floyd era that we're still in, our uniqueness, our lived experiences, our authentic selves are really currency and to be exploited particularly in larger firms, but in all firms, because as the profession does start to turn its eye and attention toward communities that we serve, you need guides, you need ambassadors, you need translators, and you want to talk about how a younger person or any professional for that matter, when placed in that situation where they've had all of this skill and talent and capability that's never been seen, recognized, or appreciated, is all of a sudden thrust into a situation where that is of great value. That is incredibly affirming and creates a sense of hopefulness that didn't exist in the past when you were just shouting in the wilderness and no one was listening. So I'm, in a sense, enthralled by listening to you all, my younger colleagues who are coming up, thinking that our future is bright. If we can keep AI in check, we'll all be all right.
Wait a minute. We can keep AI in check. I would just like to point out, this is a great segue, that AIA, this is a good question because I sit in this seat and I've seen a lot of people kind of come into leadership and come in and out of leadership. And I know we've been tackling this question. It feels like time immemorial inside of AIA. And I, as a staff member, have been involved in at least 3 diversity versions of the diversity committee at the national level. I'm happy to see where our conversation is now, but I have questions that remain still of our own membership. And from this seat, I get to see it in total, right? So how do we feel as members and as a group about how we address folks who are still intent or content with sitting on the outside of the conversation or outright being obtrusive to it?
Heather, I just want to clarify that I said AI as in artificial intelligence and AIA.
Cool. I was going to say, now wait a minute. Okay.
That's what I heard too.
Okay. But yeah, it's still a segue to my question, because also I want to know, that's also still part of it, because as we introduce new technologies and new ways of forgetting and dismissing our conversations, how do I specifically, and maybe even asking selfishly, as someone who feels responsibility for ushering this question at the leadership level, how do you see that conversation coming together, or do you see it not come? Like, how do I address those members and bring them into this more effectively?
I got my ways, but I'll let someone else get to that point.
Ray, why don't you start off?
Yeah, I want to take a slightly different tack. And I've been accused of becoming a little bit of a fatalist, but we're entering a whole new epoch, and globally and in America as well, where issues of DEI and other concerns about leveling the field and engagement and what have you will be brought into question, and in a way that, and if I allow my concerns to escalate in the way that Sergio experienced in his younger life, because a lot of the symptoms and signals are there. So I think we're going to have an even greater challenge in the future. And I think the older panelists here will be relying on our younger contemporaries, folks to shepherd a very different landscape and a very difficult landscape going forward. And I think the role of mentoring, which is, I'm going to pull it back there a little bit, is going to become even more critical, because there's going to be even more noise, more distraction, more obstacles for the very things that we think are important that we've discussed today. And that's why the idea of sort of shepherding others becomes so powerfully important today. I don't mean to throw a wet blanket on everything, but it's something that it's become a bit of a preoccupation and undeniable in so many regards. Boy, that was a downer. I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Niaz. Oh, Niaz, you're off mute now.
I'm going to try to answer how I understand the question and conversation. And of course, it just left my mind. I think, okay, it's back. So when I've tried to help people understand the importance of design and how it affects our lives, and then I'm going to relate it back to students, because we're kind of talking about students too. It's really helpful for students to see literally how design and choices of design affect a lot more than they realize. And even I've had several teachers that are really obsessed with maps and map making, and even the creation of a map and deciding what is and isn't on the map might be kind of like, to the untrained mind looking at maps, the first instance is like, oh, well, like, of course I'm going to put a road on the map because like that's how you get places. But that person can critically think about the question of putting the road on the map of like, well, that's assuming that people have cars and that's the mode of transportation for that area. Maybe people walk. And even that small decision of designing a map changes the way that people perceive an area or how they interact with an area. And so when students are able to think through, like all the way through to those decisions and how they affect people in society, then they're able to apply those thoughts in other areas of their life, including beyond studio, into their like normal lives that are outside of the classroom. And so if I extrapolate that thought onto like everyone from that experience of working with students, the more like concrete ways that folks are able to see how their actions and decisions are affecting others. And of course, that conversation has to be like facilitated and moderated in such a way. People aren't just going to like out of nowhere come to the conclusion that their actions and decisions are affecting other people negatively or positively, which would mean that someone in this group or out of this group has then the responsibility or calling to facilitate and moderate that conversation in some way, which is a really laborious task. But that kind of thought process of being able to like analyze your decisions and see the effects that they make, especially if they're particular and specific to like an individual or a group of people, is really helpful, matched with the understanding. And this is maybe less architectural, but like on that like being a good human kind of training thing, but understanding that if everyone isn't involved or has the opportunity to be involved, then the end result is going to be lacking. And that can be perceived from a technical manner, like if the engineer isn't involved, like the building's not going to stand up, whatever. But it can also be in narrative, like if we don't invite grandma to the family dinner, we're not going to get the benefit of the wisdom of grandma. And that kind of idea maybe is I don't know if that's like a trainable idea, but there's an insight in that if somehow that idea is able to be communicated to other people, the like switch goes off in the brain and they realize like, oh, in all these different instances, I didn't provide the opportunity for folks to be involved. And I on purpose actually excluded them because of the assumptions that I have about participation and people's capacities. But now I can like try to create those opportunities in the future, which are extremely hard at first too, because it's like a new muscle that you're trying to train to even think like, who are the folks that matter in the conversation. Yeah, so I think those two kind of things, like the analysis of decision making and its effects, and then also the like everyone needs to be able to have access to the conversation in whatever way possible.
Go to Julian.
And to, I guess, address Heather's question from like a more organizational standpoint without going too far off on a tangent. Kelly, be ready to stop me like 5 minutes from now. I think in this, somebody called it earlier, a post George Floyd era, and that's accurate. To be past the quote unquote like awakening of 2020, which is a dramatic term and probably more of a facade than anything else. I've noticed some people lived through that and have still decided that they will never change their mind about any of these topics. And I guess the way this is related to mentorship is that I've given this advice and I don't know if it's good advice, honestly, but bluntly, I do not care what your opinion is anymore, as long as you are not actively getting in the way of an initiative, of good work, or whatever. I'm not a pastor, so I'm not in the soul saving business. So I just don't actually spend my time having those conversations with those people if you have decided you're going to be that kind of person. Outside of somebody that actively tries to, tear down some sort of initiative or anything like that. It reminds me, yeah, Kelly, you're gonna have to stop me. It reminds me of back in 2020, I had a conversation with a man who at one point was like a grandfather to me. I don't know my actual grandfathers, but he's a pastor. Black pastor, born and raised in Louisiana, or not Louisiana, Louisville. But you know, as everything was happening, he was saying some very controversial things over social media. And I said something to him, and I was like verbally attacked, not by him, but by people that follow him. And we later had a conversation where I just told him, I need you to understand, while you may not think some of the things that you say have an active impact, I can show you that they do. It's more than just an opinion. It turns into actual action for some people. So I need you to just tone it down. Just like believe what you want to believe, but understand once your beliefs are becoming negative actions, you're having more of an impact than you're saying that you're having. It's no longer just words. But that's the most that I've had a conversation with people like that since 2020. I just can't spend my time on it anymore.
You got to ask the question, just Julian, about responsibility, right? I mean, you know,
Yeah.
if you have a platform, you have a responsibility, and some people abuse it, and others, you know, hopefully majority of people do respect it, but it only takes a few to just like set up the fire, you know.
Right.
That's a tough.
I think a lot of what's coming out of this panel could be content for future panels. So Mohammed and I are taking notes. I'd like to go to Bianca, and then I'm going to shift our question after that.
Right. So from my personal take, I'm coming from Atlanta, Georgia, born and raised. That's always been my community. That's home to this day, and moving to Portland, Oregon. So I've experienced a drastic difference in what that experience looks like in the post George Floyd era, and how it looks like coming from my perspective as a double minority, if you want to say, in Atlanta, in that experience where we can kind of try to understand how do we integrate people more to understand one frame of mind and just educate. The same thing isn't happening in all places, is what I've learned. And I think a lot of it is, and I've learned to be a very patient person in that respect, because there's so much lack of understanding and respect for other people and what their experience is. And I think that the more we have panels, the more we have discussions, the hope is that more people not be sympathetic, but take into consideration other people's experience. I definitely I'm a big advocate for that. Don't just listen. You don't have to respond. You don't have to react. Just listen. Take into what their experience is, take it home, integrate it into whatever way that it can be integrated from an AIA standpoint and an organizational standpoint, whether that be a company or a national organization. Listening is probably going to be the best way to go about it. There's no need to be that strong-willed majority advocate for all the minorities, when listening can do a better job and learning can do a better job than anything outside of that.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for all of that insight from the panelists. We are going to switch to our Q&A portion of the panel. So for those of you who are joining us as guests and attendees, if you feel comfortable turning on your camera, now's a good time, so go ahead. If you have questions, we are also going to use the chat function. So feel free to put your question in the chat or raise your hand, and we're going to kick off the question and answer part with a question from Mohammed. Go ahead, Mohammed.
I mean, it was a hard conversation for me in so many different ways. But then again, that's why I really wanted to have this. First of all, it's because, I have been between two programs, one at Portland State and then the other one at Clemson University. And both of them, they have their own difference in how I was able to learn. And so like when I was at Portland State, I was able to learn under Sergio and his program at the CPID, which is pretty awesome. And I spent more time out of the classroom. And then after that, I went to grad school and I was able to learn under Roy for 2 years. And he was more than a mentor to me, but he also became my friend, right? And he taught me a lot about things that, I didn't know, especially with the fact that, think about like me shifting from Oregon to South Carolina, which is a different state. And then when you look at it politically, the view aren't the same. So it was also, a curve in how am I going to learn about myself, about who I am as a Black man in this world. So all those things, when you think about them and just listening to the conversation tonight, I feel like it put all those things together. But what I realized is that the fire to change the profession is still here from one generation to the next. Like that fire is still the same. Because when I listen to Stephen talking about it, like the drive he had when he was young, it's the same one I am hearing from Julian and Rashad and Anna. Like that fire is still here, right? And it's still the same fire I have. But at the end of the day, my question is like, with everything that is happening, like there's a hard conversation that we are having. Like Julian was saying, they are hard, it's not easy to have because sometimes, you just don't know if you have to put yourself out there or have that emotional conversation. Yeah, because it is not here. So my question is like, what do you think the bridge should be like, thinking about that bridge? Because, I feel like the fire is here from both generations, right? And I understand that mentorship goes both ways. But how do we, better that bridge? Like, what can we do to kind of make it better? Yeah, because I mean, how do we make that bridge better? Because, we are talking about a lot of things, but also remember that this generation, like we are in right now, a lot of shit. Like we talk about the gender, like are you a male or a female or are you fluid? All those things come into the conversation. And then it also touches base with what our architectural school are supposed to be like now. So how do we build that bridge? We don't have the solution, but what is your perspective about that? What would that bridge look like in the future?
It really depends, Mohammed, on how one encounters a mentoring opportunity. If I'm walking down the aisle in the grocery store and I bump into you and you drop your can on the floor and it starts a conversation, that's one way. You meet a complete stranger and you start to have conversations. And it really is, there's so many variables in that question. It can be reduced to the level of awareness that each person may have of themselves in a space with other people. And if you're an empath, and I think Catherine offered a comment about not enough empathy in this world, which we all tend to agree with, an empath walks around with sensors just out there, and we feel and we gravitate toward that feeling, toward that need, and we engage actively. Others aren't wired that way. So it's hard to make a uniform statement about the mechanics of what you're looking for. It really is almost sort of personality driven and situation driven. You find yourself in a place and time and there's this interaction that happens, but in another place and time it doesn't happen. So you either have to be very consciously seeking or just playing the odds in Vegas, throw your dice on the table, see what you get.
Yeah, I think for me to answer that question too, Mohammed, is I think we all have to just have that agility and flexibility to keep learning and understand that the world is constantly evolving and changing, and like having these conversations with like the range today of like different perspectives and voices, it just shows that we all have something to learn from one another. And I think too, like that sense of optimism that you said, like keeping that fire burning between all of us and through generations is extremely important. I know like we talk about the post George Floyd area, but I think it's like, I don't know, you see organizations and groups that like in the moment it was, oh, we're all DEI forward, we're all driven, but like who's doing that work now? And I think that's what's important, is to keep that work flowing and going. And I think the last thing too that I really think is good in terms of keeping mentorship and evolving mentorship is just honesty, being clear about like what you want, your intentions, your goals, and just keeping that pureness in that relationship is extremely important.
Yeah, I mean, I heard you buzzing. I think that's a great answer to the question. But at the end of the day, we also need like some more structure. Like Julian was talking about the daughter program that are set up in architecture school, and I listened to you guys talking about them. They are great. So do you feel like they are right that we need to change the structure of how we teach and how we bridge those again, because they all come into play, right? Uh, yeah, I mean, that's something that I'm really curious about. Like, if you were going to change one thing, just one thing, like, what would it be? Um, mm,
Go ahead, Julian.
I'll just I'll I guess double down on what we were saying earlier in regards to community engagement in schools. I think that's something, like, to actually talk about structure. I think that is something that NAB should actually be enforcing in every school of architecture. And we're talking about a changing world and adapting within the field of architecture. And the simple fact is, you cannot adapt to something that you don't engage with. So enforcing as much outside engagement as possible within schools of architecture, I think, would be the first step, in my opinion.
Catherine, I see you have your hand up.
Well, thank you. Actually, I just want to sort of add on to what Julian just said, but what really resonated for me was a lot of what Nayaz had to say. And I really feel that there should be a role for sociology or a focus on that in architecture schools, and that maybe NAB should start looking at that and making it a specific focus that needs to be addressed, because how our profession impacts everyone's lives is so critically important. Whereas I graduated, I hate to say 37 years ago, from a master's program at UCLA, and the focus was just on design. And it was very disheartening as a 30-year-old to just, I mean, it was exciting. I'm a painter as well, and I was, love design, but to me, coming from the hippie era and civil rights, and my focus has always been on affordable housing. There needs to be a little bit more social conscious of what we're doing in the profession. But I also wanted to just put it out to you there. I know the focus has been strictly on going through an accredited college program, but I think I mentioned in the beginning, I'm on the state licensing board here in Oregon, and there are 13 states in the country that allow people to go in a work path as opposed to a college degree path into the profession. And I see, in terms of DEI, how important it is to acknowledge that not everyone can afford to go to college. Not everyone can stop working and stop supporting their families to dedicate 5 years in a school program. And I'm just wondering if there's any conversation that might take place in the future, perhaps as a different time, but talk about other paths to licensure and how valuable that could be. I know NCARB is looking at community colleges as a factor in that path. And so I hope that there will be a broadening of the profession, bringing more diverse people and voices into the profession in the future. So it'd be interesting if we could have that conversation another time, I realize, but I do want to say that I appreciated everything that everyone had to say. But I think the kind of the more sociological focus of what our profession does for humanity is a really important discussion to have. So thank you for allowing me to speak.
Thanks, Catherine. And I think your point is well taken about maybe having a different session related to the path of licensure. So Mohammed and I again are taking those notes. So Sergio, do you want to step into the conversation?
Yeah, I was going to say that just following up what Catherine's saying, as we began to try to, figure out how public interest design would be brought in, we did reach out to the social sciences because we realized we didn't have the skill sets, So I remember in the late 80s and early 90s when we were starting to try to redefine our curriculum, social sciences kind of, they became kind of our fountainhead, So we started working with even like departments at Berkeley in sociology and education. We'd have their faculty come onto the field with us, to try to figure out how to best work through this. And so, but one of the things I want to get back to is that, in a way, it's kind of architecture is such a consuming thing that it's almost, and there are going to be periods where it's going to be really tough, and we've had really tough periods. I've had really tough periods, and it's almost like the values, you almost find yourself, what are the values I want to have as a citizen and a human have to be reflected in the profession itself. So in how I practice, and it's just, I think in that end, that's what's kept me in it through the tough times. It's just knowing that I'm practicing what I want to be, the world I want to be part of, right? So you're always going to have conflict, but the ability to know that at the end of the day, you spoke out your mind and you stood for your values and things like that. It's really kind of, is really, and you reach out for others who can help you with that. That to me is mentorship. So.
Ray, let's hear from you.
Yeah, the only university experience I have as studying as an architecture student. But it strikes me that architecture education is somewhat unique. We're sort of, it's like this closed band, and generally speaking, people outside of that sphere, and I think somebody else was speaking about this earlier, really don't understand what is it that they do? Why are they there all the time? What is it that makes architecture so uniquely different? One of the things that characterize it in a simplistic way is that in a studio, you own your desk. I don't think that happens in very many curriculum, particularly in undergraduate level. So there's this unique kind of educational model that we have to deal with a whole range of complex propositions. And it's like I make architecture or designer rather akin to a director in film who isn't the actor, isn't the sound person, but it's the person that has to manage this and provide some creative direction for that. So when you think about that aspect of producing and making the manufacture of architecture, then you expand that to all the conversations and elements that we've been talking about, you realize that it's a daunting proposition, right? It's encompassing of so much. And that's something that I want to sort of bring it back to the mentorship discussion just a bit to say that in the old model, and I think it's to some degree still true, but perhaps not, is that I learned as much from my contemporaries, the person sitting at the desk next to me and across the room than I did from my critics or I did for my own work. And I think that's something that we need to continue to encourage, that kind of collaborative, cross-sectional conversation, because I do think, particularly in architectural education or at the university level, they're sort of moving, generally speaking, in the same sort of mode, same age group, kind of moving through that study. And it can be baffling very much. So in a mentoring sense, I think studios that encourage and promote that kind of engagement among the student body is a really important aspect that we tend to not formalize oftentimes, but I do think it's important. For example, we've done a lot of vertical studios, we've done a lot of team projects, but we rarely talk about how do you do that? How do you actually accomplish that? It's not particularly easy to do, particularly in a creative enterprise, because if everybody wants their own, position to be established. So within that model, I think it's really important. The other thing that I want to speak to that I think is kind of underlying a lot of our conversation, getting back to a term that I used in the very beginning, this notion of ethos. At some point in your experience, you've got to figure out who you are and what you want to do with your life, right? And how do you begin to position yourself and to be able to move through life knowing that you're going to stumble and you're going to fall, you're going to get lost, you're going to be misdirected, you're going to all of those kinds of things. But I somehow believe that within architecture, there's this creative core that tends to, at some point in your life, you'll find a centering where it all seems to make sense. It all seems to be connected in some fashion, regardless of what modality, but that sense of grounding occurs. And I try to encourage you, find that within yourself. And I tell many of my students, my undergraduate students, I say, don't go right to graduate study. Get out in the world. Take time to think, what is it that I want out of my graduate study? Undergraduate, you're tended to be spoon-fed. This is what you do, this is what you do. Graduate study, you have more opportunity to explore your own interest, but sort of define, get a sense of what that is, so that as you elect that last aspect of your formal training of education, the graduate education, that you're making an informed and important decision about where that should occur, having a sense of how do I want to be influenced and by whom do I want to be influenced. So I leave that a little bit of a caveat to the whole mentor conversation. I'm sorry.
Yeah, Ray, this is great. I was just listening to you about the, evolution from undergrad to grad, and I'm thinking it took me 50 years to get to Harvard as a Loeb Fellow, and that was when the appetite for learning was really alive, finally, to go back and get it in your terms. And like, we were the cohort that was sitting in the front row, engaging with the faculty, and all the students were up in the bleachers on their iPads and laptops and not paying attention, but it took 50 years to evolve to a point where you could really go take advantage of what the academy could offer. So it's I think I want to make the point that it's never ending. A stream of knowledge acquisition and delivery, and it's a system. It all works together. I also just wanted to leave everyone with one proverb or whatever as it relates to community engagement. In Detroit, we would get up from our side, the city side of the table, and walk over to the community side of the table. And with them, we would recite those words: nothing about us without us is for us. And those words are easy to say, but they're really challenging to live into. But that becomes this beacon to really, guide us as we work and sublimate our egos, our individual egos, for the needs of the many, and knowing that the community is granular. It's not monolithic, right? And so at my best as a facilitator, it's been creating an environment where residents can argue with each other in a civil way and reach a consensus that we can then amplify through our gifts and talents as designers and architects, right? But lots of lessons that this conversation is provoking, thought about, and we could go on forever, but that's it for me.
Well, I will say one quick thing, just quickly to pick up on what Stephen said. I had the pleasure and was very, very pleased when Stephen was doing his Loeb fellowship that he invited me and others up. And I was so proud of him, so proud of the issues, because he was having the exact same conversations. How long ago was that, Ben?
That was 2007, man.
Yeah, that we're having right now.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
Ray and Stephen's comments are a great way to conclude. And I want to thank all of the panelists for their time today and in our prep sessions, as well as our attendees today. There is a session at 10 o'clock. Mohammed, I don't know if you want to add anything about the 10 o'clock session before we wrap up.
Yeah, I'm just going to ask everybody if you want to jump in, guys. We are going to talk about accessibility. But I just wanted to focus on this panel, and then as a closing remark, really, I want to thank every single one of you for jumping into the conversation. I feel like this is like a hard conversation to have when we think about where we are in our career, like for a young folk like myself, like a mentorship board. Go bother why, like everybody said, but at the end of the day, it's about having a conversation. That's how we kind of keep driving change, right? So thank you for being part of it. I appreciate you giving us your time. And I'm really excited for everything that is going to come out of this conversation in terms of, how we are going to go out in the world and, keep on fighting the good and beautiful fight. I know it is hard, like Stephen said, but, we have to do it. And we have to do it in a beautiful way. We remind ourselves that empathy is important, and also being a good human is important. Also trying to build the world is not going to happen overnight. It takes time, and it comes to building relationship, connection, working in your community, doing all those things. And it can be exhausting, but you still have to do it because that's the fire in you. So yeah, I think that's my message, and really thank you for being part of it. If you have any final remark, please feel free to jump in. I'm sure.
Thank you for inviting.
Thank you, everyone.
Great program.
Yeah.
Mohammed, I think Heather left, so I'm going to stop the recording. Hopefully this
Yeah,
part
that's
gets
awesome.
edited out. So
Thank you.